Hey, welcome back to the final lecture of Philosophy 110 Human Nature. This is Foucault on power and the discipline of the human body. Um, a little background. Foucault was born in Poitiers, France, and he was a child during the Nazi occupation of France. And his family did oppose the Vichy regime, the Nazi regime that took hold of the country at the time, but they didn't participate in the resistance necessarily. Um, but at a young life, Foucault was clearly brilliant, but he struggled with a lot of mental maladies, especially as related to his homosexuality. So Foucault is one of the few philosophers during the 20th century who lived an openly gay life in his later adulthood. Um, but his homosexuality or sexuality was a point of constant sort of mental troubles for him at a young age, which in many ways would shape his philosophical trajectory. Um, and like Sartre and Beauvoir, Foucault was educated at the École Normale Supérieure, which again is a very prestigious public institution, academic institution in France. And there he studied under this French philosopher of science named Georges Canguilhem. And if you read Foucault's early works, especially about the development of psychology, the development of medical practice, you can certainly see the influence of Canguilhem on his philosophical thinking. Um, Foucault is also deeply influenced by French Marxism, especially as forwarded by Louis Althusser, who would later become France's leading Marxist philosopher at the time. And very briefly, Foucault joined the French Communist Party, but he was always sort of a maverick within the party, and he left eventually after he became disillusioned with what he saw as its authoritarianism. So philosophically, Foucault is considered to be a founding figure of what's known as post-structuralism, which was a sort of philosophical movement that's responding to structuralism in France, which tried to explain aspects of our social conditions or aspects of language in terms of a structure that, in some sense, schematizes it, right? Um, Even though Foucault is attributed as a founding figure of post-structuralism or alternatively of postmodernism, Foucault rejected such labels. And Foucault, he's influenced by a spread of different philosophers, but he was particularly influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche, who we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And Foucault was enamored by Nietzsche's sort of subversive approach to philosophy, where Nietzsche was less interested in trite questions of the good life and trite questions of morality. He was more interested in trying to uncover the sort of genealogies of these various concepts and practices that we deploy not only within philosophy but within social life as a whole. And Foucault had a very, to that end, Foucault had a very topical approach to philosophical studies. So Foucault didn't write, these large sort of moral or political theoretical tracts about certain concepts or themes, but he rather wrote books and articles about things ranging from psychology to medicine to political economy to prisons, etc. So his philosophy is always grounded by real world institutions and real world practices of power, um, which made him influential not just within philosophy but with other disciplines like anthropology, sociology, political science, etc. And Foucault was also an activist, but he was involved in a variety of differing social and political struggles, including prison reform, some anti-racism work in France, and human rights works against sort of various governments of the world. And Foucault is always insistent that the governed should try to organize and to sort of fight back against the governments that try to control them. However, in his later life, Foucault contracted and eventually died from HIV/AIDS, and he was only 57 when he died. And during this time, HIV/AIDS became a very prevalent disease among the gay community around the world. Um, but it was prevalent within the gay community, not because being gay would make you susceptible to contracting this disease, but because many governments around the world and many people around the world didn't want to treat people who were gay and who contracted HIV/AIDS. For example, under the Reagan administration in the United States, many people allowed thousands of gay men to die from the disease, believing that it was a punishment for their alleged sin. Um, so Foucault himself is a victim of this disease, but and so even though he died at a young age, however, his philosophical works also have a profound influence within LGBTQ plus activism. Notable works of his include The History of Madness, The Birth of the Clinic, The Order of Things, Discipline and Punish, which is what we read, and his a dozen or so lectures at the college. Okay, so Foucault, if there's there's a few concepts that anchor Foucault's philosophy, and one of them is this idea of power, right? And so Foucault's philosophy, or maybe precisely Foucault's political philosophy, is concerned about power and how different kinds of power produce different kinds of subjects. Um, and subject here retains this philosophical sense of a being who exercises agency and a being who is at the center of philosophical study, or at the center of philosophical inquiry, right? So for a lot of philosophers who write about human nature, for example, the subject is the human, or if you want to be more precise, man, quote unquote, right? If you're a Marxist, the subject within your sort of philosophical worldview is the proletariat, right? And the subject is the being that exercises agency, and in some senses, the subject is the one that sort of moves the gears of history in a certain way, right? Um, but for Foucault, there wasn't the subject. There were multiple different kinds of subjects, and subjects are produced from the configurations and the applications of power in society. But Foucault has a very nuanced understanding of power. He doesn't think power is a substance, right? He doesn't think that power is just something that you can possess and that you can use to your own benefits. Power can certainly be that way, but Foucault thought power was much more expansive and much more plural. Specifically, Foucault thought that power is always a relational affair, and power is exercised through various different kinds of institutions, practices, and forms of knowledge. Uh, and Foucault has this concept that he's rather well known for, this idea of power knowledge. And it's this idea that power is based on, or power presupposes this regime of knowledge, or these sort of background assumptions that help to engender that power. And by that same token, knowledge itself, or the knowledge that the power uses as a presupposition, is reproduced through the application of power itself, right? Um, and for Foucault, the problem with much of political philosophy up until his time, and in terms a lot of the problems of political activism, is that he thought that they only focused on power, or the kind of power that is practiced by states and governments and figures of authority, uh, but were very inattentive to these more subtle forms of power, which he thought were equally, if not more so, nefarious in certain instances. So Foucault liked to think in terms of differing modalities of power. So the first kind of power is probably familiar to most of you. It's what he calls sovereign power, and this is simply the kind of power that is exercised by sovereign authority over his or hers, mostly his subjects or citizens within the specified territory. Excuse me. Um, so you can. This is the kind of power that's practiced by kings, princes, emperors, dictators, right? And the sort of principle that defines sovereign power is this right to take life, right? And the sovereign's life is regenerated through the ability for its ability to take life. Um, you can think of sovereign power as Hobbes' idea of sovereign authority, right? And in many ways, Foucault traces this idea of sovereign power back to Hobbes' Leviathan. Um, in that, people within the social contract alienate many of their rights of nature to the sovereign so that the sovereign can mediate conflict. But in so doing, you grant the sovereign absolute executive or political power to carry out vengeance or revenge on your half. And the rights of the sovereign include precisely the right to maim, kill, torture, take life if it benefits the stability of the state. Um, but sovereign power, and for Foucault, these modalities of power, it's not like they proceed in stages, right? They overlap with each other, they're mixed with each other. There is no situation where it's purely sovereign power. There is no situation where it's purely disciplinary power. In many ways, they're meshed together in this patchwork. But the problem with sovereign power is that it's not the exclusive means by which modern day regimes or modern day relations of power occur at the level of the subject, right? So the second kind of power that Foucault discusses, and the one that we're going to focus on more closely here in this lecture, is disciplinary power. Disciplinary power is the kind of power that is not exercised over a territory or over a sort of a population, but it's a kind of power that's exercised primarily at the level of the body, at the level of the individual body. The point of disciplinary power is not necessarily to take life, but it's to produce what Foucault calls docile bodies through techniques like regimentation, examination, surveillance, etc. So institutions that are governed through disciplinary power include things like schools, prisons, asylums, military barracks, etc. We'll talk a little bit more about disciplinary power in a second. The final form of power that Foucault utilizes in many of his philosophical writings is this idea of biopower. Biopower is the exercise of power through the administration, regulation, and control of life at the level of the population. So this is the kind of power that you see through things like statistics, the census, political economy, and public health, right? And unlike disciplinary power, biopower extends the techniques of power at the level of entire populations. So you can think of, for example, a very recent phenomenon is the COVID pandemic, right? And the way in which the government or related social or political institutions handled the COVID pandemic was to enact biopower, right? It sought to utilize statistics, it sought to utilize public health, quarantine, data in order to mitigate coronavirus and to be able to promote the health of the population, right? And unlike sovereign power, which is predicated on this right or ability to take life, biopower is governed by this principle of enhancing life and letting die, right? So the reason why biopower isn't always so gracious, the reason why biopower can be nefarious, is that the practice of power that enhances life, but oftentimes also neglects other parts of the population, which it considers to be unhealthy or which it considers to be a social pariah of sorts, right? Even though this practice of power is maybe a lot more subtle than sovereign power, which is predicated on killing people who transgress the sovereign. Okay, so discipline and punish, which is what we read today, studies the theoretical and philosophical underpinnings of the development of the penal system in France, right? So again, Foucault is a very topical philosopher. So instead of just writing about the philosophy of punishment or the philosophy of prisons, he wants to sort of look at the history of how prisons or the penal system developed and the sort of theoretical or philosophical assumptions that helped facilitate that development. And Foucault wants to reject the oft-stated talking point, especially at the time, that the prison developed as a more humane form of punishment. So, before the development of prisons, the primary way of punishing transgressors was just to either execute them or torture them and then let them go, right? Hoping that they learned their lesson. But for Foucault, or rather for many people, they thought that the prison was more humane because it wasn't necessarily predicated on just executing or torturing people, it's predicated on correcting people for their bad behavior. But Foucault wants to argue that it wasn't simply that the prison, that the development of prison also constituted a new form of power that was predicated on disciplining bodies at the individual level. So for Foucault, a lot of what the discipline and punish tries to do is to track the transition from sovereign power to disciplinary power in the instance of the penal system in France, right? So again, Foucault's not saying that there's no longer sovereign power. Sovereign power is still here even today, but through the development of the penal system, we also saw the emergence of a new kind of power that was coeval to sovereign power. And as we mentioned the last slide, disciplinary power is conserved with producing what Foucault calls docile bodies. And docile bodies are basically bodies, human bodies, right? So, uh, what I'm inhabiting right now, or what you're inhabiting right now, I would hopefully assume. Docile bodies are bodies that are conducive to the institutions of modern bourgeois society, right? So, factories, military units, schools, etc. And it seems strange that Foucault wants to focus on human bodies when talking about these institutions, but it makes sense, right? For example, in the context of a military barrack or a military unit, you're trying to shape a body that is conducive to being able to march, to take orders, to fight in combat. In the context of school, you're disciplining a body to be able to sit down and to read and to listen from the instructor and to go from class to class. In the context of a factory, you're disciplining a body to be able to work on the line and do very repetitive work for hours and hours on end, right? So all these institutions are predicated on a disciplined, docile body that can do that kind of work. Um, for Foucault, these two forms of power also constitute two different forms of punishment of transgressions, right? Um, so under sovereign power, what we would call punishment is basically just uh, about making these examples through public torture and execution in order to discourage any future transgressions, right? So this might seem very, barbaric to today's standards, but back in the old days, if there was someone who was, accused of murder, well, you take that person to the public square, and then you execute them to try to tell other people who are watching to tell the spectacle to not murder, right? Um, and similarly, if someone was accused of, say, stealing, the royal guards capture the guy and they'll maybe cut his hands off and they'll let him go back on the streets. Um, and even though this kind of punishment was clearly cruel and very brutal, it was also simple, right? It wasn't predicated on this idea of trying to reform the person. In many ways, it didn't lead to sort of permanent imprisonment of these people. In the example of the thief, you simply just cut the thief's hand off and then you let him go and live out the rest of his life, right? So it's a very blunt and very straightforward way of enacting punishment against transgressions. Um, Under disciplinary power, on the other hand, however, punishment is less so about just torturing or executing people. It's more about correction or reform, right? So the point of disciplinary power is to try to reshape bodies, to reshape individuals, to become more predictable, scheduled, and cohesive with the institutions of the broader society. So if this sounds familiar, this should have familiarities with what we read in Nietzsche and the genealogy of morals, right? Where he characterizes morality as a way to make people into predictable beings with the right to make promises. So here you can see Nietzsche's influence on Foucault, because under disciplinary power, what disciplinary actors are trying to do is trying to recreate or reshape people to, again, become cohesive with the rest of bourgeois society. And you do this through various techniques, or what Foucault calls techniques, which include regimentation, so having people sort of follow very orderly schedules, through surveillance, through inspection, and through training, right? So with the example of schools, right? School for Foucault is a disciplinary institution. So students go into the classroom, they sit in a row of desks that faces the instructor, and the instructor watches them, and the instructor makes sure the student is acting in a way that's conducive to being not only a good student but a good member of society. So if the student is not paying attention, then the instructor disciplines the student. If the student is falling asleep, the instructor disciplines the student. If the student is not doing good on assignments, the student is not good at following orders, not good at following a schedule, is always late to class. All these things, right? The instructor is there to discipline the student to prepare them to enter into the workforce, to enter into the broader society. And so disciplinary power, whereas sovereign power just targets anyone who transgresses the sovereign, right? So it doesn't really matter who you are. It doesn't matter what your race is. It doesn't really matter what your gender is. It doesn't matter if you're, if you're a quote unquote a madman, right? Um, it only boils down to whether you transgress the law. If you transgress the sovereign, and then the sovereign power will punish you through torturing you or executing you or doing all these things to make an example out of you, right? Disciplinary power, on the other hand, targets those who transgress the social order by virtue of these binaries that we set up in society, right? So you have the law-abiding citizen, and then you have the criminal. You have the sane person, then you have the insane. You have normal people, and then you have abnormal people, right? Um, and disciplinary power tries to target the sort of negative signifier of that binary, right? So the prison targets the criminal by trying to correct for them to become law-abiding citizens. The asylum targets the madman to correct them to become people with the mental ability to integrate into society and enter into the workforce. Hospitals or leper colonies target the abnormal in order to make them sort of normal. Yeah. And in the section that you refer, discipline and punish, Foucault wants to talk about panopticon specifically, as designed by Jeremy Bentham. So Jeremy Bentham was an English utilitarian philosopher, uh, mostly writing in the 1700s and the 1800s. And the panopticon was this design for a prison that was circular. And then in the very middle was a guard tower that stuck out. And from the top of the guard tower, there would be this light that constantly rotates uh, um, from the top, and it gives off this impression of constant surveillance, right? So you can see the image here of what the panopticon looks like. Um, Foucault is obviously interested in the actual architecture of the panopticon, but he's more so interested in the sort of principle or the sort of philosophical assumptions that underlie the design of the panopticon. And Foucault, he wants to suggest is that many of our institutions of society, specifically disciplinary institutions, are governed through this panoptic principle. So he has this quote here, quote, hence the major effect of the panopticon, to induce in the inmate a state of conscious and permanent visibility that assures the automatic functioning of power. So to arrange things that the surveillance is permanent in its effects, even if it is discontinuous in its action. That the perfection of power should tend to render its actual exercise unnecessary. That this architectural apparatus should be a machine for creating and sustaining a power relation independent of the person who exercises it. In short, the inmates should be caught up in a power situation of which they are themselves the bearers. Unquote. The reason why Foucault says this is because in the actual physical panopticon, right, each prisoner is led to believe that there is a guard at the top of the tower constantly looking at them, right? But the genius of this design is that the guard doesn't even have to be there because the panopticon is dark except for the light that's shining against the prisoners. They have no way of knowing if there's actually a guard up there or not. So it inculcates this constant sense of being surveyed, whether or not there's actually someone there surveying them or not. And Foucault writes that if this becomes effective enough, or excuse me, sorry, I'm talking Bentham. Bentham writes that if the panopticon becomes effective enough, the prison won't even need cell bars, won't even need prison bars anymore. You can just have open rooms because the panoptic tower itself will be sufficient to discourage prisoners from escaping. And for Foucault, he thought that the panopticon, or the principle that underlies the panopticon, is an ideal diagram of power relations because it minimizes actual use of force. So You don't really need a lot of prison guards with sticks to beat prisoners into submission, because instead he can inculcate the sense of constantly being watched. Um, and for Foucault, he wants to suggest that the design of the panopticon has become generalized at the level of society as a whole, where subjects, us in this case, subjects, we modify our own behaviors uh, uh, under the sense or under this affect that we're constantly being surveyed by others within that society, right? To compare this with B.F. Skinner, who we talked about in the last lecture. So Skinner wants to actually argue something very similar to Foucault, whereas Skinner thinks that this is a very humane way of proceeding through sort of controlling environmental conditions in order to change human behavior. Foucault wants to suggest that this can be potentially a dangerous form of applying power. Um, because discipline or disciplinary power attempts to shape or mold bodies to comport in such a way that's conducive with social institutions that are always so great, right? So at the point of the prison, and especially in the early days, prisons tended to incarcerate, working class people, workers, because the idea of the prison was that you would reform these people to become more effective and productive workers that don't transgress the social order, right? Unlike Skinner, for Foucault, he thought that when we talk about disciplinary power, we should always think about it in terms of the set of social interests and the kind of institutions that are imbricated within it. Um, Foucault ultimately wants to suggest that disciplinary power is quote polyvalent in its applications. It serves to reform prisoners, but also to treat patients, to instruct school children, to confine the instance. Uh, sorry, I should say insane. To confine the insane, supervise workers, to put beggars and idlers to work. Unquote.